Все видно?
Да. Я тогда представлю, значит, первый докладчик у нас доктор Мартин Хрибек, университет Чарльза, да, факультет искусств. Но тему доклада вы все видите на экране. Рабиндранат Тагор в Праге, впечатления, переводы, преображения. Насколько я понимаю, доклад будет идти на английском языке, да?
Да.
Хорошо. Пожалуйста.
Уважаемая доктор Вечерина, уважаемые коллеги, дорогая Татьяна, дорогие друзья. Для меня большая честь и удовольствие говорить здесь сегодня в знак глубокого уважения к памяти Александра Михайловича. У меня была привилегия знать его в последние 2 десятилетия его жизни. Я благодарен за эту привилегию покойному профессору Ярославу Вацеку, ученому, исследовавшему санскритский, тамильский и монгольский языки, который был директором отдела индологии в Карловом университете в Праге, современником и давним другом профессора Дубянского. Мы встречались почти каждый год в рамках проекта «Панданус» на семинарах в Праге, Варшаве, Кракове, Миладо, Каgliari и Каликуте. И один раз, в частном случае, тоже в Москве, когда он устроил мне интересную экскурсию по Московскому центральному кольцу. Я не мог избежать этой личной прелюдии, включая несколько фотографий, которые напоминают мне о его доброте, мудрости и чувстве юмора. Но теперь позвольте мне продолжать на английском языке с моими тагореана-боемика. So this short presentation, roughly outlining the reception of Tagore in Prague and some of the reactions, will follow these 5 steps. First, setting the stage for his reception due to the position that India had in the national imagination of Czechs. Then his early translations, some reactions of the interwar period, and then the transformation of his reception after the Second World War during the communist period, and finally, after the Velvet Revolution. The social, cultural, and literary context of Tagore's reception in Czechoslovakia was located in the discourse of Czech national revival and the role that imagination of and knowledge about India had to play in it. Tagore was thus perceived by Czechs not only as a purveyor of Oriental wisdom and a celebrated writer, but also as a cultural ambassador of a brotherly nation. No less important for the reception of Tagore was the early establishment of Indological studies in Prague, Sanskrit since 1850. The news about the Nobel Prize for Literature awarded to Rabindranath Tagore in 1913 was widely publicized in the Czech press, often in connection with the fact that his closest competitor was the Austrian author Peter Rosegger, who was considered the writer of The Enemy of the Austrian Empire and of the German cultural sphere, and who was also personally involved in some Germanification processes in Slovenia. The first complete Czech translation of Gitanjali from English was produced in early 1914 by a philosopher, translator, and author of 2 treatises on Czech nationhood, František Balej. The demand was such that the book had to be reprinted 5 times till 1921. The second book, Examples of Poetry and Prose of Tagore, was translated directly from Bengali by Vincent Lesny, an Indologist and founding figure of Bengali studies in Prague. Lesny originally studied languages of ancient India, namely Sanskrit and Pali, but later he became interested also in Hindi, Marathi, and Bengali, and wrote extensively about social and political affairs in India in the 2 decades before her independence. Lesny exchanged letters with Tagore from 1913, and has to his credit that he was the first European translator of Tagore directly from the Bengali originals. In fact, the first non-Bengali translator of Tagore directly from Bengali originals. Examples of Poetry and Prose were published few months after Balej's translation in 1914.
Мартин, вы меня простите, пожалуйста, у вас презентация не движется.
Наверное.
Мы не видим, у нас только это заголовок и все, больше мы ничего, она не передвигается. У вас написано, что надо активировать как-то. Вот сейчас вы переехали, да.
Сейчас видно.
Сейчас видно кадр с двумя обложками книг. Вот сейчас видно Винсент Лесный.
И до сих пор этот только этот
стоял
слайд.
Вот этот слайд, да.
Да, фотографии
да,
с Дубянским мы не успели увидеть, да.
Вот сейчас вот вы, наверное, стрелочкой должны это щелкать вот так вот, ага, вручную.
И сейчас изменяются.
Сейчас изменяются, да. Да, вот сейчас вот мы видим Франтишек Балый, Винсент Лесный.
Винсент Лесный, да.
Да.
Вот этот первый перевод из бенгалского.
Да.
So this is thank you, and I'm sorry for this problem. So this is the frontispiece of the first Czech translation of Tagore directly from Bengali original. There are excerpts of Gitanjali, one short story, The In-Between Woman or Modobortini, from the collection of stories Golpogucho, and 4 excerpts from Sadhana, translated from English. It was Lesny's academic authority, along with that of Moritz Winternitz, which largely contributed to the fact that Tagore was interpreted in the Czech discourse as a poet and a philosopher, and only marginally as a prophet or a seer. Nevertheless, his translation came out in an Orient Library series as number 5, being preceded by the Parables of Christ, Holy Quran, Talmud, Dharma, the teachings of Buddha, and then the 5th was the poetry of Rabindranath Tagore. So he was taken almost as the representative of Hinduism, along with the main world religion texts. Interestingly, the graphic design of the front cover has the name of Sri Rabindranath Tagore in beautiful Bengali font. The emphasis on contemplative poetry clearly related to the horrors of the First World War. The major Czech publisher of Tagore recollects in the late 1930s. I cannot miss to mention the great consolation that Gitanjali and Sadhana provided to our Czech soldiers during the World War in their most trying moments when they were leaving for the battlefield. Before the departure of every new contingent of recruits, our sails soared. In the interwar period, Home and the World, The King of the Dark Chambers, The Post Office, and Lectures on Nationalism were published in early 1920s. The latter, the Lectures on Nationalism, were translated by Vasil Kapralek-Škrach, a philosopher, sociologist, and also a close associate of the first Czechoslovak president, Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk. The translator himself felt compelled to comment upon Tagore's notion of nationalism in his afterwords. He said, quote, Rabindranath Tagore uses the terms nation and nationalism in a different sense than we usually do. Tagore understands nation to be chiefly an instrument of political, economic, and technological civilization. For us, on the other hand, a nation is a natural collective individuality whose members feel the bond of blood, love for the soil, and understand fully their cultural community. As we can see, Tagore's opposition to Western nationalism is in fact very close to our humanistic nationalism. What he actually means by nationalism is Western etatism and imperialism. End of quote. The translator really struggles to identify Czech national awakening and Czech nationalism with Tagore's humanism in order to establish a common front of Czechs and Indians against the various types of imperialisms, of which he considers the pan-Germanic the most heinous. This forced attempt at forging the affinity with Indians, however, was not shared, unsurprisingly, by the revolutionary left. Thus, Josef Hora, a notable poet and literary critic of the interwar period, referred to Tagore in his essay, The Cultural Meaning of Our Times. In that essay, Hora glorifies the USSR and damns nationalism. He further discusses Tagore's nationalism and fervently criticizes him as a representative of the retrograde, religious-minded East, as opposed to the progressive East of Russia. He said, "Even today, there exists a genius preaching to Indians joys of subjugation. How beautiful human being is this Indian poet, and how bad a citizen. Was blood spilled just for us to pray and wait in mystical ecstasy for future truth? Thanks God not. European blood is more revolutionary than that. There is another East apart from India. There is Russia and the example it gave us." In 1921 also marked the first visit of Tagore to Prague. The poet came on the invitation by Vincent Slesny, whom he had met in October 1920 in London, and on the invitation of Moritz Winternitz, who was based at the German University in Prague and who had corresponded with Tagore prior to his visit. Both Indologists were instrumental in presenting Tagore to the Czechoslovak public, Czech and German respectively, and both in turn accepted Tagore's invitation to become visiting professors in Shantiniketan. On this slide, Tagore just has come to Prague, and he has Moritz Winternitz to his left on the picture and Lesny to his right. Now he's being welcomed by a girl in the Czech national costume and the mayor of Prague. And this is a group photo in a Prague saloon, along with Ramananda Chatterjee, Benay Kumar Sarkar, also Winternitz and Lesny and others. This slide is just coming out of the National Theatre, where one of his plays was staged. And another friend who Tagore knew from London and who was going to become an art teacher in Shantiniketan was the painter Jaroslav Hněvkovský, sometimes dubbed the Slav Gauguin. This slide is one of the paintings he made of Tagore while being in Shantiniketan at later periods. Although general reports in the press conclude that the performance of Tagore met with great applause, we can find one highly satirical article by a noted literary critic, Arne Novák, who points to the shockwaves that Tagore sent through the more rigid section of the academic audience. This quote is from this review of a lecture he did in the Convocation Hall of Charles University, my alma mater. In fact, it was not a lecture, it was a holy ceremony. Great sacrificial and benedictory gestures, chants, none of that was missing. If he could observe his surroundings, he would have felt at home. The Brahmins and Hanumans sit still on elevated benches of the professional guild and strike strange poses. They are not amazed, they are not happy. At first, they do not know themselves why, but one thing they know for sure, that the sacred university soil has been abused. A scripture which mortifies will always hate spirit which enlivens. Alas, there is no method here, only intuition. There is no guilt, no rank, not even the academic distance, just the monster of a personality. The bureaucratic order was taken over, albeit for 1 hour, by the flesh of a genius. Mr. Tagore of India is perhaps wise, but for sure he is possessed. He drank the nectar of holy waters, not the content of an inkpot. That's why he ignores so arrogantly everything. A clear-cut framework, logical procedures, and, what worse, even the university officials and deans. And then the most horrific thing happens. Rabindranath starts singing in the Convocation Hall. The composer, Leoš Janáček, one of our internationally most well-known musical composers, attended a different lecture by Tagore. And this experience prompted him to write a passionate article for a local newspaper, including a notation of the speech melody of Tagore's voice, reciting his poems in Bengali. Janáček was in the habit of listening people's speech melodies and noting those melodies in notation on his cuffs. So that's probably how he first noted the speech melody of Tagore and then reprinted it in a newspaper. It was not a speech. It sounded like a song of a nightingale, smooth, simple, void of any harshness of the diphthongs. It occurred to me to fall in with a gay chord with the initial sounds of the poem he read out. I heard soft harmonious voices or sounds, but it was incoherent to me. The melody kept on falling down in a torrent of tones. Janáček wrote his famous male chorus with boy soprano, The Wandering Madman, on the words of the Gardener 66 in 1922. The last lines of the same poem are also engraved in Janáček's tombstone. The Wandering Madman by Janáček is available on YouTube, so if you want to hear what he made out of the Gardener, it's available. Other personalities who were deeply impressed by Tagore's lecture included the prominent Czech photographer, a practitioner of Vajrayana meditation, and a collaborator of the Theosophical Society, František Drtikol, who made studio portraits of Tagore during his second visit in 1926. In Shantiniketan archive, I found letters which said that he was under some kind of a false pretext of a breakdown of a car. He was stopped in front of the studio that he called and then invited to spend some time inside while the car is being repaired. And that he used those moments to make studio portraits of Tagore in bromography. And also Karel Čapek, the most prominent Czechoslovak author of the interwar period, who was instrumental in organizing Tagore's second visit to Prague in 1926 as the head of Czechoslovak Pen Club. Čapek met Tagore privately and observed him with a sympathetic yet distant and highly inquisitive eye, as is evident from his description of the meeting. Quote, "In this grey attire of rough silk, this delicate old man looked like courageous God the Father or Moses, or an apostle by an artist from Nazareth. His speech is soft and sweet, his silence still sweeter. His slightly grey-haired secretary, Proshanto Mohalanobish, in keeping with ritual promise, stays away from meat, but gulps down open sandwiches with ham. Does he believe it is a fish or what? Rabindranath Tagore, with hands cupped on his chest, seems to pray. One expects a miracle will happen. Instead of a miracle, the beautiful old man rises, floats around the room, and says his goodbye in a thin voice. Tomorrow he has a lecture, or rather, he sings his poems. When he recites his drama, he utters the female part with a childish high pitch. His whole presence radiates not just an Oriental culture of poetry and thought, but, and perhaps still more forcefully, a strangely refined culture of aristocratic physical perfection and live aestheticism, which is self-conscious in every movement." It is interesting to observe how, of course, not only Czech, but his world audiences strongly reacted to how Tagore looked and to his voice in particular. And, you know, this oral and tactile reception of Tagore, I think greatly influenced the reception of his works and should not be perhaps taken lightly or taken as a kind of separate experience from the reception of his works. Another moment when the path of Karel Čapek and Tagore crossed was in 1938, or rather in 1937, the last Christmas Eve of independent Czechoslovakia before the Nazi occupation, when all waves of Czechoslovak radio sent an appeal for peace, which was directed to the West and to the East. The personality of the West was Albert Einstein, and the personality of the East was Rabindranath Tagore. So on this slide, we have Karel Čapek on the left, František Hřibek, our electrical engineer and creator, and Vincent Lesny, who read the English appeal to Tagore in English and with also some Bengali at the end. There were plans of the Czechoslovak radio to have Tagore in Calcutta replying directly, but those plans were stalled partly by the British and partly by bad organization on the part of Czechoslovak radio. Nevertheless, Tagore listened to that message and wrote a poem in response, which was a couple of days later also read by Czechoslovak radio. So this is a facsimile of the poem. Prayaschita. After the Second World War, during the communist period, Tagore started being presented differently, predominantly as a religious and social reformer, as a progressivist, and a fighter against superstitious practices, an anti-imperialist, yet at the same time, a critic of those fellow runners who placed the national sentiment over social emancipation of the people. His anti-fascist position was also often emphasized, including his condemnation of the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. The translation shifted from poetry and lyrical dramas to prose and to more worldly side of his writings. Especially the years around the birth centenary of Rabindranath Tagore brought extensive editions of his works translated from the Bengali originals almost single-handedly by our greatest scholar in the field of Bengali studies, Dušan Zbavitel, already mentioned by Professor Billy Moria. The main result of this effort were collected works of Rabindranath Tagore in 3 volumes, published in 1958, 9, and 1960, respectively. The last volume also included the translation of letters from Russia. Interestingly, the letters were conforming to the censored Soviet edition, not to the original Bengali. Still, despite the fact that it was the edited version of the letters, the reviews the letters received were mixed. One review, albeit generally sympathetic both to Tagore and to his translator, contended with respect to letters from Russia that Tagore, quote, did not fully understand the complex dialectics of humanism and revolutionary violence, end of quote. The period after Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia and the ensuing change of discourse allowed for broader contextualization of Tagore's literary and intellectual endeavors. The readers were keen to absorb all what was prohibited and suppressed during the communist regime, and in that context, renewed interest in things religious and spiritual emerged. While the original nationalist interpretation of Tagore largely fell into oblivion, and his progressivist interpretation lost ground with the fall of the regime that produced it, he remains a known figure of world literature and a representative of Eastern philosophical thought, somewhat as if his reception made a full circle. Tagore also remains a source of inspiration for Czech music composers. In a rather extravagant example, a Czech world beat band named ADE, After Death Experiences, turned one of haiku poems from the Fireflies collection into a nearly 4 minutes long song with a video clip, which would have surely left Tagore astounded. Let my love, like sunlight, surround you, and yet give you illumined freedom, goes the poet. Yet in the hands of the rather punkish Maori-style tattooed performers, his idea of non-binding love turns into a Freudian drama, where the words illumined freedom are punctuated with a scene of a little girl's doll being snatched and destroyed as in a voodoo ritual. Here are some clips from that musical clip, which is also available online. Once again, Tagore is interpreted within the context of Eastern mysticism. But this time, instead of juxtaposing East and West, the band synthesized a collage where elements of jazz, reggae, Czech folk music, Tagore's and Rilke's lyrics, and visuals of Maori tattoos fuse in quite a Rabindric fashion into a stream of world beat. And so far, I have a collection of about 45 musical compositions by Czech composers inspired by Tagore's poems. So thank you for attention. This is all from me.
Большое спасибо. Есть ли у кого-то вопросы? У нас еще есть 5 минут на обсуждение.
Можно я спрошу?
Да,
профессор Hribek, можно я по-русски спрошу? Вот вы сказали, что был переведен «Дом и мир» еще в 20-е годы, да, роман?
Да, да.
А потом его как-то переиздавали. Получил он этот роман какой-то отклик среди читателей? Или, в общем, его не очень читали потом? Переиздавался ли этот перевод?
Да, переиздавал, но надо сказать, что в наших периодиках нет много реакций для его романа. Как в 20-х и 30-х годов большинство наших авторов писало об его стихах, нет об его прозах.
А вот Карл Чапек что-то написал, вот вы процитировали статью Чапека, его впечатление от личности Тагора. Чапек у нас тоже очень популярен, и лично я очень люблю Чапека. Но Чапек написал ли что-нибудь о Тагоре, как о поэте или как о прозаике?
Да, написал, вот эта цитация была из одного короткой статьи 2 стран. И более не написал, еще один раз заметил Тагора, но ничего большего не написал.
Мне кажется, что Тагор не мог быть слишком ему интересен и близок. Это все-таки очень разные типы писателей.
Да, они встретились, потому что Чапек был руководителем чехословацкого пен-клуба. И я думаю, что это была платформа, на которой они встретились.
Спасибо.
Но можно сказать, что Чапек и Тагор, они были такие классичные авторы, нет более чем романтичные.
То есть вы считаете, что все-таки между ними и есть и сходство важное, да?
Нет, важное сходство, но они использовали литературу в какой-то цели, и чтобы изменяли свет, чтобы изменяли свой народ. В этом возможно найти какое-то сходство.
А нет каких-то вот чешских сравнительных студий литературоведческих, вот Тагор и Чапек, или Тагор и еще кто-то из чешских писателей? Есть такие исследования?
Да, есть один символичный поэт, с которым был Тагор сравниван, который называется, извините, не знаю, если он был переведен на английский, но он был переведен на латинский. Вот это.
Ой.
Sorry, just came out of my mind. But,
No, it's okay.
Ольга, можно еще один маленький вопрос задать?
Да.
Мартин, спасибо большое. Я хотела спросить, вот, была ли какая-то реакция в Чехословакии вот на феномен Тагора в театре? Ведь он создавал очень много танцевальных драм и вообще во многом создал такую революцию даже в отношении музыки, танца, звучащего слова, вот этой перформативности в Индии. Но какого-то рода понимания или влияния вы немножко вот упоминали о роли и влияние на музыкальную жизнь, да, ну как бы как это вот если объяснить, да, двумя словами, то есть какого рода влияние вот это вот театральности, перформативности в творчестве Тагора, какого рода знания или какого рода впечатления были вот в Праге, вот, и вообще в Чехословакии?
Спасибо. Первый ответ профессору Серебряному. Отокар Бřezina.
Отокар Бřezina. И вот его сравнивали с Тагором, да?
Да, да, его поэзию. И тоже на английском месте это сравнение. И в театре несколько some of the plays by Tagore, они были уведены в Национальном театре в Праге несколько разей, немного разей, и в союзе с его connection with his visits in Prague. So there was this reason to sort of show his plays, and he was also present at one of the shows, but they didn't have too many. They were not showed too many times. But in spite of that, there's evidence that his plays are being up to date, staged sometimes by school theaters, by small scenes. But you can't say that his plays would have great impact on Czech theater productions. It's usually a personal effort, and that some note in this particular play strikes the director or the collective. So there's individual initiatives, but you can't say that there is any lasting impact which would be possible to sort of analyze on Czech theater as such.
Большое спасибо, коллеги. К сожалению, доктор Мартин Хрибек, к сожалению, у нас время переходить к следующему докладчику.
I'm sorry, there is a question. There is a question from Professor Belimore in chat.
Может быть, вы можете это...
There is a question in chat.